They doubted her. The whispers followed her like echoes, just loud enough to reach her ears but soft enough to be deniable. Dr. Malcolm Pierce wasn't the kind of professor who needed to raise his voice to command the room. His presence alone was enough. And now, standing at the front, he didn't just call on her. He singled her out. Let the silence stretch long enough for the weight of it to settle. He wanted this to be a lesson, a moment everyone in the room would remember. But as Riley Carter gripped the strap of her backpack just a little tighter and stepped into the lecture hall, something in the air shifted. It wasn't just the usual tension of a competitive classroom. It was heavier, thicker, the kind of pressure meant to remind people like her that they weren't supposed to be here. She had felt it before. The unspoken doubt. The way spaces like these seemed to close in around her, questioning her right to exist within them before she even had a chance to speak. But today, something felt different. She moved to her seat near the front, flipping open her notebook with quiet precision. Around her, the low hum of voices carried through the hall. Some students exchanged glances. Others scrolled absently through their phones, waiting for class to begin. The room itself was designed to make students feel small. High ceilings, endless rows of seats towering above, and a massive chalkboard stretching across the front like a barrier. It was the kind of place where presence alone wasn't enough. You had to prove you belonged. Then, Dr. Pierce placed his leather-bound notebook on the desk, scanning the room with an expression that gave nothing away. He was known for his brilliance, his brutal expectations, and the way he dismantled students before deciding if they were worth rebuilding. And not everyone got the privilege of being rebuilt. His gaze swept over the sea of students, tailored blazers, expensive watches, and quiet confidence, before landing on Riley. He let the silence drag, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smirk but came close. "Miss Carter," he said, stretching her name just slightly, just enough to make it feel foreign. "Let's see what you've got. Come up and solve this for us." A quiet shift moved through the lecture hall. Not just the usual rustling of students adjusting in their seats. This was something different. Interest, curiosity, amusement. Riley knew exactly what this was. A test, and not the kind written into the syllabus. She exhaled slowly, closed her notebook, and rose. Every movement was measured. She wouldn't rush, wouldn't hesitate. Any sign of nervousness would be seen as confirmation of what they already assumed. Dr. Pierce held out the chalk. She took it, stepping past him, her fingers steady. The equation on the board was meant to trip students up. Complex, layered, designed to catch even the most prepared off guard. Not impossible, but dangerous in the wrong hands. She heard the whispers behind her. "She's going to mess this up. Let's see if she even knows where to start." But Riley didn't waver. She lifted the chalk, and in that moment, the doubt in the room didn't belong to her. It belonged to them. It was difficult. Difficult enough to set a trap for anyone who dared to step forward. Riley Carter could hear the whispers behind her, hushed but sharp, a mix of skepticism and quiet amusement. "She's going to mess it up." Another voice, less cruel but just as doubtful. "Let's see if she even knows where to start." She blocked them out. The noise didn't matter. It never had. Numbers had always made sense in a way people never did. This wasn't about whether she could solve it. It was about whether they were ready for her to. Taking a breath, she lifted the chalk and made her first mark. But she wasn't just going to solve it. She was going to change the way they saw her. The moment Riley's chalk touched the board, the room shifted. Not entirely silent, but close. The occasional rustling of paper, the rhythmic tapping of a pen against a desk, background noise that faded as eyes locked onto her. She moved with precision, each stroke deliberate, writing out the first steps without a hint of hesitation. This wasn't just about reaching the right answer. It was about how you got there. There was a longer, safer way to approach the solution. The kind most students would take. The kind Dr. Malcolm Pierce expected. But Riley saw something sharper. An alternate path that cut through the problem with clean efficiency. A method only someone who truly understood the material would recognize. At the front of the room, Dr. Pierce stood with his arms crossed, watching. His usual mask of detached indifference hardened into something more focused. He wasn't just observing anymore. He was waiting for her to slip. Riley reached the midpoint of the solution and paused, just long enough to check her work. Not because she doubted herself, because she knew others would. She had learned long ago that people like her were watched more closely, judged more harshly, so she made sure there was nothing to question. The whispers had stopped. The students who had smirked earlier now leaned forward slightly. A few adjusted their seats as if they needed a better view. The equation was unraveling beneath her hands, falling into place exactly as she had predicted. Behind her, someone exhaled sharply. "She's actually doing it." Another voice, lower, almost begrudging. "And she's doing it fast." At the front, Dr. Pierce cleared his throat, shifting on his feet. "Make sure you're not skipping important steps." But Riley wasn't skipping. She was outpacing. And for the first time, she knew he saw it too. "Miss Carter." Dr. Malcolm Pierce's voice was even, controlled, but there was something sharper beneath it. Riley Carter didn't turn around. "I'm not." The words landed like a quiet shockwave, not because of what she had said, but because of how she had said it. Calm, steady, absolute. A ripple of reaction moved through the class, subtle but unmistakable. Someone shifted in their seat. A few exchanged glances. At the board, Riley wrote her final equation, boxed the answer, then took a step back. She placed the chalk on the ledge, arms folding as she turned to face the room. Silence. For a moment, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. Then, Dr. Pierce stepped forward. His eyes scanned the board, moving over each step with slow, deliberate precision. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he traced the solution with his fingers, checking each transition. But the longer he stood there, the clearer it became. He wasn't looking for confirmation. He was searching for a mistake. Riley watched, unmoved, arms still crossed. The seconds stretched. Finally, Dr. Pierce let out a short breath. His jaw tensed as he turned back to the class. "An unconventional approach," he said. His voice was measured, but the weight in his words was undeniable. But correct. The room absorbed his admission, and in the silence that followed, there was something unspoken. He hadn't expected to say it. Then, from the back of the room, another voice broke the moment. "That wasn't just correct." A woman stood. Dr. Elaine Parker. That was brilliant. The shift was immediate. Acknowledgement. Validation. The kind that couldn't be undone. But while one professor was willing to recognize her, the other wasn't ready to let this moment belong to her just yet. Dr. Pierce's fingers tapped lightly against the podium. His smirk, the one he wore so effortlessly, was gone. In its place, something sharper, something more rigid. He turned back to the board, scanning Riley's work again. Not to admire it, to find a flaw, to take back control. But there was nothing to find. The room was still, too still. Students sat frozen in their seats, eyes locked onto the front of the room, waiting for what would happen next. Riley Carter could feel their stares, the weight of their shifting opinions. Some had expected her to stumble. Now they weren't just watching her. They were watching Dr. Malcolm Pierce. What would he do now? "Interesting," he finally said, his voice measured. "But let's take a closer look." Riley exhaled quietly. She already knew what was coming. Men like Dr. Pierce didn't acknowledge being outmaneuvered. They didn't admit defeat. They redirected. He reached for a fresh piece of chalk, stepping toward the board with slow precision. Underlining part of her solution, he tilted his head slightly. "You chose to bypass the traditional method here," he said, his tone almost conversational, cutting directly to the derivative transformation. Then he turned to her. "Tell me, Miss Carter, why did you assume this was the best approach?" A subtle trap, disguised as a question. He wasn't doubting her answer. He was challenging her authority to make that decision at all. But Riley didn't flinch. "Because the traditional method introduces unnecessary steps," she said, her voice as steady as her work. "This approach eliminates redundant calculations and reaches the answer faster." A pause. Then, a shift. A few students adjusted in their seats. Others scribbled notes, realization dawning as they saw what she had done. She hadn't just solved the problem. She had just taught them a better way. It was a better method than what they had been taught. A fact settling over the room, shifting the air in a way that was almost tangible. Dr. Malcolm Pierce raised an eyebrow, his expression carefully unreadable. But there was something else. Something just beneath the surface. A hesitation. A calculation. "And what if I told you that cutting steps can sometimes lead to miscalculations?" His voice was smooth, controlled. A test, just like everything else. Riley Carter met his gaze without a flicker of doubt. "It can," she said simply. But it didn't. Somewhere in the room, a quiet chuckle broke the silence. The tension cracked, just slightly. Not enough to shift the balance of power completely, but enough. Enough for the students to recognize what had just happened, what Riley had just done. She hadn't just answered him. She had shut him down. cleanly, precisely, without over-explaining. Dr. Pierce pursed his lips, his grip on the chalk tightening. A subtle shift in posture. A moment of recalibration. "Confidence is commendable, Miss Carter," he said at last, his tone measured. "But let's test it, shall we?" He turned sharply back to the board. With swift, deliberate movements, he wrote out a new equation. This one wasn't meant to test knowledge. It was meant to break confidence. A brutal layering of variables, limits, exponentials. Every trick in the book. The kind of problem that demanded absolute precision. One misstep, one careless assumption, and everything would collapse. He stepped back, chalk dust clinging to his fingers. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, he gestured toward the board. "Let's see if your method holds up here." The challenge was clear. Riley didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, picking up the chalk as if the weight of the moment didn't touch her. She scanned the problem, breaking it down in her mind before the first mark ever touched the board. Yes, it was difficult, but difficult wasn't impossible. She exhaled slowly and began writing. This time, the weight in the room felt different. It wasn't just expectation. It was curiosity, interest. The once dismissive glances had changed. The students who had barely acknowledged her before were now leaning forward, pens hovering over their notebooks, their skepticism replaced with something else. Anticipation. They weren't just waiting to see if she would fail. They were waiting to see how she would solve it. Her strokes were steady, deliberate, each movement measured. The first transformation, then the next. She wasn't rushing. She didn't need to. The silence in the room had changed. It wasn't hesitation anymore. It was something far more dangerous. It was belief. She didn't pause, didn't second guess. The board filled with calculations, each step flowing seamlessly into the next. Deliberate, precise, unstoppable. She wasn't just solving a problem. She was rewriting the process itself. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The room was silent, except for the steady sound of chalk against the board. Dr. Malcolm Pierce remained still, watching, his face betraying nothing. But the weight of his gaze was unmistakable. He wasn't just observing. He was waiting. Waiting for her to misstep, to falter, to prove somehow that this was a fluke. But Riley Carter didn't falter. She reached the final step, boxed her answer with a clean stroke, then capped the chalk and stepped back. She turned, her expression unreadable. That's the solution. The silence that followed was deafening. Pierce stared at the board, unmoving. His features were carefully composed, but the seconds stretching between them spoke louder than words. Then, from the back of the room, a voice rang out, slicing through the thick air like a blade. "That," Dr. Elaine Parker said, standing as she strode toward the front, "is nothing short of genius." It wasn't just the words that shifted the atmosphere. It was the authority behind them. Pierce remained still, his jaw tightening just slightly. The tension in his posture said what his silence refused to. But while the professors were processing what had just happened, the real shift was happening among the students. The energy in the room was different now. What had started as a quiet test of Riley's abilities had become something else, something undeniable. Students who had barely acknowledged her before now sat forward in their seats. The ones who had once dismissed her as an outsider were now watching her differently. Whispers spread in hushed tones, no longer mocking, but filled with curiosity. "Did you see that?" someone murmured. "She skipped 3 steps and still got it right," another whispered. Riley could hear them, but she didn't react. She simply walked back to her seat, her movements calm, composed, like nothing had changed, even though everything had. At the board, Dr. Parker crossed her arms, her sharp gaze scanning Riley's work. "Not only is it correct," she said after a moment, "but she found an optimization most students wouldn't even think to attempt." She turned, shifting her focus toward Dr. Pierce. "You should be impressed." The weight of the moment lingered, but Pierce said nothing, and that silence, more than anything else, proved what Riley already knew. She had won. Dr. Malcolm Pierce's jaw tightened for just a fraction of a second, so quick that most wouldn't have noticed. But Riley did. He cleared his throat, a calculated motion, as he adjusted his tie and took a step forward. His presence remained commanding, but there was something different now, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. "It's certainly a different approach," he said, reaching for the chalk. "But let's examine." Dr. Elaine Parker cut him off. "No need," she said smoothly, her tone light but firm. He froze. "I've already checked it," she continued, arms crossed. "It's flawless." For the first time, Dr. Pierce hesitated. It wasn't the words that unsettled him. It was the implication. He had built his career on being the final authority in his classroom, the one who dictated what was right, what was acceptable, what was worthy of recognition. And yet, here was a first-year student, one he had so clearly underestimated, shifting that unspoken order, without ever needing to say a word. Riley Carter kept her gaze forward, unmoved, waiting. She knew better than to celebrate too soon. The room still held its breath. A few seats over, someone stirred. A student who had laughed at her earlier now hesitated before raising his hand. "Professor?" The voice was unsure at first, but then stronger. "Can Riley explain how she saw that shortcut?" A pause. I wouldn't have even thought to approach it that way." For the first time, Riley blinked, momentarily surprised. The shift had happened. The class wasn't just watching her anymore. They were listening. She had expected resistance. Maybe another dismissal. Maybe a challenge. But this was different. Dr. Elaine Parker nodded, turning toward Riley. "That's an excellent idea," she said smoothly, before addressing the class. Then, to Riley, "Would you mind walking them through your reasoning?" For the first time that day, Riley hesitated. Not because she didn't know the answer, not because she doubted herself, but because no one had ever asked her to explain her thought process. Not as a test, but as something worth understanding. She let the silence settle for half a beat, glancing back at the board, gathering her thoughts before speaking. "I looked at the structure of the equation first," she said, her voice steady but measured. "Instead of working through the standard steps, I recognized a pattern in the coefficients that allowed me to factor out certain terms early. That simplified the problem before I even started solving." A few students nodded. Some scribbled notes, their pens moving quickly. Others simply stared at the board, as if seeing it for the first time. A voice, low and almost to himself, broke the moment. "That's why you skipped the second step," a student murmured, his brows furrowing in realization. It wasn't a guess, a pause. It was intentional. Dr. Parker smiled slightly. "Exactly." Dr. Malcolm Pierce remained quiet, not arguing, not correcting, just watching. Watching as the room shifted around him. The students who once followed his lead without question, taking his judgments as law, were now looking at Riley differently, with respect. It wasn't instant, it wasn't unanimous, but it was there, creeping in, breaking through the assumptions that had settled over the room when she first walked in. But Riley didn't need their validation. She never had. She had never sought their validation. But watching the doubt in their eyes turn into something else, that was its own kind of victory. Yet, this wasn't over, because the real reckoning wasn't with the students. It was with Dr. Malcolm Pierce. The air in the room felt different now. Pierce stood stiffly at the front, shoulders squared, but something was slipping. His usual air of control no longer absolute. And that was the real shift. For the first time, the class wasn't waiting for him. They weren't looking to him for validation, for confirmation, for the next step. Their attention had shifted to Riley, to her work, to the realization that she wasn't just capable. She was exceptional, and he could feel it. The subtle change in the air. The way students who had once hung on his every word were now looking at him with a different kind of anticipation. Not to lead them, but to see how he would respond. His grip on the chalk tightened. For a moment, he simply stood there. Then, finally, "Well," he said at last, his voice carefully neutral. "It seems Miss Carter has a unique way of approaching the material." A pause. One that stretched just long enough. Then, softer. Unique. As if the word itself left a strange taste in his mouth. But everyone heard it, and that was enough. A single word, but one that danced dangerously close to dismissal. Dr. Elaine Parker, standing just a few feet away, caught it immediately. "I'd call it advanced," she countered, tilting her head slightly, her voice measured but firm. "She didn't just solve the problem." A pause. "She optimized it. That's not just talent." She turned slightly, her gaze sharp as it settled on Dr. Malcolm Pierce. "That's mastery." His lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time all class, he was cornered. And he knew it. His usual tactics wouldn't work here. Not after Riley Carter had proven herself so decisively. Not with Dr. Parker reinforcing it. So, he did what men like him did best. He adjusted his tie, forced a thin smile, and nodded. "Yes, well," he said smoothly. "I suppose we'll see how she performs on the next exam." Riley didn't flinch, but she understood exactly what he meant. This wasn't over. But it didn't have to be. She had made her point. As the class gathered their things, the murmurs returned. But they weren't the same. The quiet dismissals, the amused glances, they were gone. Now, students who had ignored her before glanced her way with curiosity. Some with admiration, others with quiet uncertainty, as if, for the first time, they were recalibrating everything they had assumed. And that, more than anything, was proof. She had changed the game. In real time, the shift continued. One of them, a guy who had openly doubted her earlier, hesitated as she packed her bag. She caught the movement from the corner of her eye but didn't acknowledge it. Not yet. "Hey," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, his confidence wavering for the first time. That was impressive. Riley Carter didn't pause, didn't soften, didn't seek his approval. She simply glanced at him and said, "I know." He blinked. Then, after a beat, let out a small laugh. "All right then." She slung her backpack over her shoulder, walking toward the exit, her steps steady. She had spent years proving herself in spaces that weren't built for her. This was nothing new. But today, something had shifted. Not just in the room, not just in the way they saw her, but in the way she saw herself. She had always known her worth. But now, so did they. Because respect isn't given, it's earned. And she had just earned it. She stepped out of the lecture hall, the door clicking shut behind her. The cool afternoon air hit her skin, a sharp contrast to the tension that had filled the room moments ago. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past hour settle. She had done it. Not just solved the problem. Not just stood her ground against Dr. Pierce. She had changed something. She pulled out her phone, scrolling absently through her messages as she made her way across campus. A notification popped up. "Jordan, how was class?" Riley smirked, thumbs flying over the screen. "Riley, same as usual." A pause. Then, "Riley, except I just made Pierce eat his own words." The typing bubble popped up almost immediately. She grinned. "Jordan, no way, what happened?" Riley Carter stared at her phone for a moment, considering how to sum it up. How do you explain shifting the balance of power in a single text? She thought about watering it down. She didn't. "Riley, let's just say he tried to put me in my place, and ended up losing his own." Jordan's response was immediate. "Jordan, that man has been a problem for years. About time someone made him face it." Riley let out a quiet laugh. But she wasn't foolish. She knew one moment wouldn't change everything. Dr. Malcolm Pierce wasn't going to suddenly respect her. Some students would still view her as an outsider. Some systems took longer to crack. But this wasn't about them. This was about every student who would sit in that chair after her. The ones who would walk into spaces not built for them. The ones who would carry the same weight of unspoken expectations. She had forced a shift today. Not just in the room. Not just in how they saw her. But in how she saw herself. She had never been an exception. Never been an anomaly. She had always been exactly what she was. Brilliant. Unapologetic. Unshaken. And now, they knew it too. She slipped her phone into her pocket, her steps lighter than they had been that morning. Because respect isn't handed out. It's taken. And she would take it every single time. So if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been made to feel like you don't belong, let this be your reminder. You don't need permission to be great. Your talent is already enough. Keep pushing. Keep proving them wrong. And when the moment comes, don't hesitate. Take up space. Own your brilliance. If this story hit home for you, pass it on. Subscribe for more stories that demand to be told. Your success isn't up for debate.